Welcome to the webinar titled Creating a PBIS Behavior Teaching Matrix for Remote Instruction. This presentation is brought to you by the West Virginia Behavior Mental Health Technical Assistance Center. The center is made possible by a collaboration between the West Virginia Autism Training Center at Marshall University and the West Virginia Department of Education's Office of Special Education and Student Support. The content of this presentation is based on the practice brief released by the Center for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, which can be found at www.pbis.org. The presenter for our presentation is Alicia Zeman, who is the coordinator for the West Virginia PBIS project.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our second trial at a Zoom meeting, and we once again kept it very small for this initial time. We are still rather new to Zoom. We're learning how to provide services to our schools in this unique time that we're in. But we really wanted to start slow and start small. That's often what we suggest our schools do when they're implementing new things, and we were doing the same. We wanted to give you all time to adjust to the new normal that Hal was talking about just a little bit ago. We know our schools, that first week, we all felt the same way. Everybody was in shock. We were trying to figure out what to do and how to feed kids. And then we know our counties and our schools were working towards figuring out how to do this distance learning or remote learning instruction and how to reach our most vulnerable kids. So we wanted to not overwhelm you with new information as we were trying to figure this all out, but we have found that we're starting to get a few more questions and people are starting to think and starting to make connections between what we know, what we do in a brick and mortar school, and how can we move that over to remote learning and distance learning environments. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We are going to put out there, we know that Zoom has had some security issues in the past, and maybe even today in other Zoom meetings. If for some reason something happens, we will stop this and we will find a way to get this information to you. But if we do happen to have a Zoom bombing, we've put passwords on, we've done everything, we've followed all the rules, we should be okay, but we want you to know we know that that's a possibility as well. And we're looking forward to sharing. This is actually the first of 5 trainings that we have coming up, and they're coming up in quite a quick succession. We'll have another one on Thursday, and we'll have 2 more on Tuesday and Thursday next week, and the week after that as well. We're going to be talking things like, how do you help your families use PBIS at home? How do you acknowledge kids via distance learning? That's taking some creativity, and we're learning a lot of great things that we're excited to share with you about that. What can we do for our most vulnerable students? What are some of the best practices we're seeing? What are our suggestions? How can we still be trauma informed within this new environment that we're working in? And we're also going to have a webinar based on self-care for educators. I think self-care was super important, and we were talking a lot about it before we transitioned into distance learning during the coronavirus, but I think it's even more important now. I've told our crew at the TA Center, I understand toxic stress now more than I ever have before, and how it affects the way you think and how it affects your body and how it just kind of changes the way you view the world. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in an upcoming webinar, and we hope that you'll join us for that. Today's webinar is actually based on a sorry, there was a notice that came up and I got distracted. So there was a document that came out from the Center on PBIS, Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, and it really is, the name of it is Creating a PBIS Behavior Teaching Matrix for Remote Instruction, and that's what we're going to cover today. So, of course, this is being presented by us at the Behavior Mental Health Technical Assistance Center. This is what the document looks like. You can Google it, or you can go to pbis.org and pull it up for yourself. But what you'll notice is that what we're talking about is exactly what's coming from this document. It's a very strong document, but sometimes it's great to be able to have discussions, ask questions, and have somebody go through it with you to have that understanding. And I know you all are learning so much new stuff that we thought it would be great to take this document and be able to share it with you as we learn how to operate in this new environment. So, why a matrix? We're going to start with a matrix just like we do when we're in our school buildings. What a matrix does for our environments is that it makes it safe, predictable, and positive. And that's really what our kids need more than anything else. Another reason we're going to start with a matrix is it should be familiar. If we've been operating in a PBIS environment or a multi-tiered system of support, this idea of having a matrix that spells out to us what is expected and what that looks like, what it feels like to meet those expectations should be familiar to our kids and to our teachers. And right now, what isn't better than having something that is familiar in our lives? And this is what we know. We know that PBIS can still make learning, even if we're doing it virtually, more effective. What I've found is, as I talked about how our schools have been rolling through this process, is now I'm starting to see things maybe on Facebook of what do we do with a disrespectful student? What do we do if a kid comes to our Zoom meeting and he's eating the biggest, sloppiest sandwich we've ever seen? What do we do if you know, a teenager comes to our Zoom meeting and they don't have their shirt on? Like, all these things are occurring because even if we're not in the same physical environment, kids are going to be kids, and kids are going to challenge any situation that they're in. And we know that if we can set up for them an understanding, we can't expect them to meet expectations we haven't shared with them and haven't taught them. And we have to do the same thing even in this unique situation that we're in. So that's why we're going to start with a matrix. The same reason we would start with a matrix when we're working within our school. We have to start with, what are we expecting our kids to do? I love this quote from the Teaching Matrix document. It's important to stress that online instructions are just like real life interactions with the same positive and negative social consequences for behaviors. And one of the reasons I love this quote so much is because for the longest time, really up until March, online world was their kids' own world. Maybe it was monitored by their parents, maybe it wasn't, but their identity and what they've learned to be their social skills on the internet was what they had most likely learned on their own. Sure, we might have provided some safety tips in our classes, but they've never really expected the online world to be as formal as what we're needing it to be right now. So what we're really having to do is not only learn everything, try to provide what we can for them, but we're also having to go back and fix some mistruths that they've learned on their own about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for online interactions. They're not going to pick that up unless we're guiding them for what we're expecting in this new learning environment that we're expecting them to learn in. So, why a matrix? If you've been to our academies, if you've been to probably any of our trainings, you've heard us say over and over, if you want it, you must teach it. And that's the same whether we are face-to-face in a classroom or face-to-face in a Zoom meeting, or we're expecting our kids to work off of Schoology or however or a packet or whatever they're working off of, we need to make sure that we're teaching them how we want them to do it, what we need it to look like, and how we're going to say that it's successful. And we have to teach them that we're relearning these misrules about how we're going to interact online and what it looks like to be in an appropriate learning environment. So, how to build a matrix. And I think what's coming to me when I started looking at this, I was really kind of panicky, just like everybody else. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to take what I know. My school buildings are gone. My teams are gone, and you're not really gone. You're just not where I can visit you at the moment. But when I started really looking at this and learning more about it and reading this document, we've been here before. We've built matrices before. We've built lesson plans for what we want that matrix to look like. We've done these things before, and we're going to do it again. It's just going to have a little different view to it than what we've done in the past. The first suggestion that the document shares is that it suggests that we stick with the school-wide expectations, that we already have in place. This makes perfect sense to me because that's going to provide us that familiar language, consistent language that our kids are used to. It means that we aren't having to use brain power to come up with new expectations that go along with distance learning. It's also giving us the opportunity to show that our kids that our expectations apply regardless of location. And I know that was one of the things when I was working in the school, we wanted our kids to realize. We wanted our kids to realize that we use be respectful, be responsible, and be safe. But we wanted them to realize that that was a way to be a good adult when you grow up. And that was being safe, respectful, and responsible was great things to do in the grocery store. And it was the way you should act in a restaurant. And we wanted them to know that that was important for our school and for the way we function, but it was also important for how we were going to function as we go out into society. And being able to bring these school-wide expectations that we've already taught, that we already know, and being able to shift them over into this virtual land only backs that up more, that even in this environment, we're still needing you to move, be respectful, be responsible, be safe, be your best. And now we're going to show you how we do that now. And we're going to show you that we're figuring it out, and we're going to ask you to figure that out with us as well. So if you think about our matrix, typically we have on the left side of our paper, we list our expectations, our school-wide expectations. And on the top, what we typically do is we set the physical locations of our building across the top. And then we talk about what those expectations look like in each of those environments. We have to make a shift in this because we don't have the brick and mortar locations, common areas that we're going to be talking about. What we really want to start thinking about is how do we want those expectations to look in the common virtual settings for your situation that you have up. So I know each county is doing it differently. Some are using Google Classroom, some are using Zoom. Some counties aren't allowed to use any of that. Some are using just Schoology, and the child is pulling their activities off of that almost like in an assignment book manner. Some counties are still doing packets, different everywhere we go. But what we need to think about is how your county, how your school is set up, and then think about where do you need to teach expectations for? So is it going to be, do you need to have expectations for what it looks like when you enter a Zoom meeting? Do you need to have expectations for maybe a small group that you're pulling out? Do you need to have expectations for what it looks like when you're doing teacher-led independent work when the teacher's not there with you? Should we be having conversations about what it looks like if we're having a one-on-one session? I know some speech therapists are doing, and even counselors are doing some one-on-one sessions. So what are the expectations, and what does it look like to be safe, responsible, respectful, or whatever your expectations are in those unique virtual settings that we're asking our kids to enter into? And when we're doing that, we also might need to be thinking about social emotional competencies as we're doing that. So how are we teaching them? If I think there's a space within our expectations and in the matrices we're making, this is how you're safe, respectful, responsible if you're feeling lonely. This is how you're safe, respectful, responsible. These are things you can do if you feel like the situation you're in is not safe. Because our kids, we're having to figure that out now. How can we even put that into verbiage where we can share that with them and give them resources? And if we're struggling to figure that out, I guarantee you that they haven't even made those steps. So even thinking about adding those into our matrices that we have in place or that we're going to build for them. Also, you might need to think about if you're having specific apps or software that they're using, they might need their own separate expectations as well. So maybe you found a software or a virtual app where they're able to communicate with other kids, making sure that we're talking to them about what is safe, respectful, responsible, whatever your expectations are in those environments where you're communicating with other kids within the software or specific app. And I also think we need to really be thinking about what routines do they need to follow. So just like our classroom, you might have to think and teach out specific routines. And I know as I was building this, Amy Kelly and I talked a little bit about, like, is the timing off for this? You know, because we've had a lot of kids. Some schools, some counties started like March 17th. They started really early. Some people are just now entering in. Some are trying to figure out how to do it. But it's never too late to provide this foundation for them, especially if you haven't provided this foundation for them and now you're seeing behaviors. To be fair and to be clear, and clear as kind, we need to go back and make sure that we are being very clear about what our expectations are and what the routines are. And it's okay to say, hey guys, let's go back and let's think about what we did in school. Let's make it, we're going to make this virtual classroom mimic this. And these are the routines and this is what it's going to look like. So, but you might need to think out routines about how do you enter a chat? As a teacher, are you going to give them some unstructured time so they have a few minutes to chat? Can you find a way to greet each student who enters your chat? I know recently I set up a virtual meeting for my son and his friends, and it was really interesting. It was the first time they had done that. There was a lot of awkward silence. There was a lot of staring at one another. There was a lot of like trying to figure out where they were at. And then everybody talked at once and nobody could understand one another. And then we went back to awkward silence. So what they really needed, even in that informal get together so they could see each other, they needed some structure because they couldn't figure out, first off, third graders aren't the best conversationalists to begin with, but they needed some structure to be able to figure out how to take turns via online and what to do, how to start a conversation or ask a question, because they just didn't have that skill. And they need it in the classroom, but the teacher is there to, it's easier in person than what it was online from what I noticed. But they also needed time to ask each other questions like, are you okay? When do you think this will be over? What are you missing? There was a lot of almost therapy or it was almost cathartic for them to be able to hear each other's voices about what they were worried about. So is there a time that you need to have a routine for sharing for your students? If you're having that ability to meet virtually, are we giving them a time to hear age appropriate concerns and how they're handling things? And what's the routine and structure that you're going to set up for that so it's not a free-for-all? You also might need some routines for like, how do they turn in work? I spent Friday with spring break here in Harrison County, but I was checking on my son's work and he had turned some of his work into the wrong teachers. And so we really had to talk about a routine for him of how he can check to make sure that it's going into the right place, because none of this is second nature to them. And a lot of the, especially elementary kids, were asking them and their parents to do stuff that is brand new. And we know that the more we can provide structure and routine for them, the more successful that they're all going to feel for that. But also routines for how to answer a question, how to ask a question, how to state a concern, how to organize their week. There's a lot of executive functioning that is being expected of our kids right now from all grade levels that our kids who had trouble unpacking are now being expected to be very independent and turn their work in and organize their week in ways they probably never had to think about before. So providing them with routines and suggestions on how to do that will only be able to make them more successful. Some other things we need to consider, and they really only exist in the online world, is what's the appropriate use of video? What's the appropriate use of audio? I added that little no shirt, no food, no lesson, because, you know, we have kids who are challenging maybe what the social norms should be for online learning, but I'm not sure if we've even established what the social norms are, and they're only going to know that if we're clearly providing that information to them, modeling it for them, and giving opportunities to practice the best ways to handle this online world. When we need to talk about the kids who aren't online, we know that we have lots of kids in the state of West Virginia, but it's also it's a U.S. problem as well, that we have lots of kids who do have access to online learning, but we have a lot of kids who do not. So we can organize this for them as well. So if you are in a county, or one of your expectations as a teacher or a county admin is to make weekly phone calls to check on students, maybe even making a matrix for yourself, sharing it the next time you hand out a packet of this is what the teacher is going to do. This is what the parent's going to be expected to do. This is what the child's going to be expected to do with these weekly packets, these weekly phone calls. Making some agreements about what those expectations will be, and then making sure we're having these conversations about what additional supports might they need. And I pulled this from online, and it's really about virtual learning expectations. And it's a checklist of what students should be doing, what teachers will be doing, and what parents may help by doing these certain things. And when I thought about our kids that are using packets, or our kids that were having a hard time being able to connect with them virtually, I thought this setup would almost be better than the traditional matrix that I'm going to show you in just a minute. But that will allow you to have some expectations being shared with them in a different manner than when we typically think about a matrix. But this would work. This would say, students, we're expecting you, if you're working off packets or you're working off some other non-virtual, we're expecting you to do these lessons. We're expecting you to have a way to turn them in, if possible. The teachers will provide this for you. We will provide some support via phone calls, whatever that would be. But that's just another way of looking at expectations and having them spelled out for our students and for their families. I also think what I began hearing more and more of is that our parents are, as they should be and as they always are, but even more now, our parents are really the most important stakeholder we have right now. We're putting a lot of pressure on them, not because we want to, it's just the environment, that's just the situation that we're in. But I've heard that and seen a lot of parents just really struggling with even how to organize this week. I feel like as teachers, our teacher brains work in certain ways where we organize lessons, we organize weeks, we organize how things are going on, and that's really not second nature to most of the people who are asked to be teachers at this moment. So what we found is, and what my former coworkers have found and other teachers I'm talking to, that parents are really needing some extra support. Things like a sample schedule for the week, a checklist for the work due in a week, just that next layer of support like we would do for really any of our kids who showed us that they had these needs. Maybe they just need access to a printable blank planner page for them to be able to organize and write it out. One of my former coworkers, she's amazing at this organizing, she made a weekly schoolwork checklist for her parents. So when it came up on Schoology, this is one of the first things that they saw. So her parents were struggling with being able to make sure that they were getting it all turned in and organizing it. And a lot of parents have multiple kids, and there's a lot of things, and the way it's coming up is not always easy to identify what's due when. So even this simple schoolwork checklist visual, she got so many responses from her parents saying, this helped me so much. It made me feel like I could get through this week and understand what was going to be expected of my kids. For my own little guy, we have a planner, and I write out his lessons a lot like this, and he goes through and makes sure he gets them done, and we've spread them out through the week because that's what it looks like in our county. That was second nature to me, but I'm a planner person anyway. But a lot of our stakeholders are needing extra support from us at this moment to be able to figure out how to best support their kids in the learning and the teaching they're being expected to do. The important thing to remember about a matrix is that posting the matrix alone isn't enough. Just like in school, having your matrices posted in your hallways and in your common areas is not enough. That's not where the prevention lies. The prevention lies in explicit teaching and practice, and that's what's still needed. So there might be a video that needs to be made about this new matrix, and there might be lessons that need to be provided to the students so they have an opportunity to practice. There might need to be some Zoom time, Google Classroom time, whatever you're using to talk specifically about what we're wanting that class period to look like. And as always, the more active or interactive you can make it, the better off it will be. If students can have input, I think we'll probably learn more than what we would ever dream of, like what's really annoying on their side that they would like to have some expectations around, what's really helpful for them, how can they reach out, how are they finding supports. The more you can have their suggestions, the more powerful this foundation you're laying for them is going to be. Here's an example of a distance learning behavior matrix. They split it up into 2 different areas, and they actually put their expectations at the top, but they split it up into distance learning and technology. But if you look underneath integrity, it talks about always thinking before posting. So they are wanting their kids to use that and think about something that they're posting. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? That is a great skill to have, but that's something that if you just put it on the matrix and we're not ever teaching it, that they're probably not going to use that. So that's something on this matrix that I would pull out and make a specific video about or a specific lesson about. Even if I'm going to assume that the school has done this within their building, but it is important to pull it out and think about it in terms of the environments that our kids are in now. And I think that's important. I think it's dangerous right now to assume that they're able to transfer skills that we know that they had. So it's almost as it has been for the last month, starting over, making sure that even that foundation we had built in the school is going to be able to carry over to what we're asking them to do now. Here's another example. And I think that I love the idea of adding family support on the end. So not only what are we asking our kids to do in a learning zone or a playing zone or when they're using technology, but what can the family do to support the kids to be peaceful, respectful, inclusive, determined, and engaged. We're going to talk more about that in an upcoming webinar about how to set up PBIS at home and how to support our families in being able to do that. But I love that this is just added into what they have added. And I think these are things that we could use social media for. I know social media is not always our first, has not always been our first line of defense. Some of us are better at it than others, but I think this is a quick little 30-second video of we're putting this up. Let's think about these things and being able to have families walk away with, oh, our family can adopt peaceful, respectful, inclusive, determined, and engaged as well at home. This is the example that was within the document that this was all built upon. And I like how they've really specified, like we need to talk about how we're entering class. What's going to happen when it's a teacher-led whole group instruction, what's going to happen when it's one-on-one, and what's going to happen in small group activities. And there in parentheses underneath small group activities under safe, it uses, it says use stop, leave, talk when you hear disrespect. Well, I'm not sure what that means. So I hope that there's a well-defined lesson talking about what that means and what it looks like within this environment that they're in now. So some things that I also think about, I think it's super important to still use visual pre-corrections. So I made this little box off to the side that maybe that's what they see when they walk in the Zoom room. Remember, audio on mute until we begin. Have your video on at all times and answer the poll questions or whatever the expectations are today. But being able to visually see those pre-corrections so we can really be proactive in meeting maybe the challenging behaviors that are occurring before they begin. Just like the classroom, the more engaged our kids can be, the better off we're going to be for outcomes, both academically and behaviorally. So using polls for increased engagement, using different, there's all kinds of different, and they're emerging because we're learning how to do this as we fly the plane. But the more engaged kids can be, the less behavior we're going to see. That's true whether we're sitting in a classroom or we're meeting virtually. Using behavior-specific praise is super powerful. It's super powerful in the classroom, in the schools, and it's super powerful now. And a lot of what I've been seeing, there's a lot of emphasis on praise and acknowledgement because we know that there's a super challenge for the other side of that for the discipline flow charts. And there, we can talk more about that in future webinars if you're interested, how you can set up a behavior flow chart for distance learning. But behavior specific praise is there's a lot of power in that. So being very specific of, Amy, I really appreciate how you're paying attention right now and taking notes. That's being respectful and responsible. Great job. And that's going to perk people up in a Zoom meeting. I bet you Amy just popped her head up and said, hey, she said my name. That kind of thing will keep engagement of occurring in your online classes. And also communicate with families. We know communicating with families before this began was a struggle. And I think when we think about communicating with families, I think we need to remember that a lot of our families are still, if you think of like Maslow's pyramid, a lot of our families and a lot of us are still at that very bottom. We're talking safety and survival right now. And so as we're asking them to do more and more, some of our families and some of our individuals, and it might be people that you never expect to be struggling, are really, really struggling with how to figure out how to do this all. So communicating with families, and I'm going to say communicating with families with grace and realizing that some of us, a lot of us, maybe all of us are really struggling with this new normal that we have, but being open with what we're seeing in classrooms, what we need from our families, and finding out how we can support them more. I mentioned problem behaviors, and they're going to occur. They're always going to occur. I think we need to be very, very careful about just excluding them, because at this point in time, if we just exclude them, if we just kick them out to the waiting room, if we just say, you're out today, that's not appropriate behavior, there's a good possibility we might not get them to return. So we really need to start having some forethought of what are we going to do when problem behaviors occur. But there are some best practices that we know. And essentially what this whole presentation is doing is taking the best practices that we know that works in the environment, and shifting it to what we're doing now. So things like, if there is a problem behavior, it's always best to correct behavior privately. It's always best. That's best practice to do that. Really upping your game and praising and acknowledgement, using class contingencies. We have a really cool webinar coming up about how we can set that up, but I have a little sneak peek for you. If you go to Teacher Pay Teachers, this is an example of a digital version of coupons that this teacher has set up with a point system. And she set it up with a point system. You can set it up based upon the acknowledgement system you already had. So if you use tickets, scan your tickets and be able to send them to your kids, either via the chat or via email. And then she has a lot of great ideas, and there's a lot still emerging great ideas of how we can have acknowledgements in this virtual world. We started digging for this. My friend and I started digging for this because she actually had a parent say, hey, I know you use those tickets in your classroom. I think I could really use them in my home environment. And so she texted me and she said, do you know anything about acknowledging in the distance, in distance learning? And I said, I've been hoarding this information, waiting for people to start asking. But things like maybe what they ask for is for the teacher to send them snail mail, or maybe they get to skip a pass, or maybe they get to do a show and tell, or maybe they get to show you their house, which I'm sure the parents will love, but it will mean a lot to the kids that they're able to do that. But there's a lot of creative thinking about how we can start acknowledging kids for what we want to see, for turning in their work, for doing their iReady, for answering questions in class. We can shift that over to our new environment now as well. What I really want you to think of is your plan of action. This is really good information, but not only are our kids in different locations, our whole staff is in different locations, and just like our families are handling that at different levels, our teachers are handling that at different levels as well. So thinking ahead of how will you share this information with your staff? Good news, this training is going to be recorded, so you can share this as well. But what's your plan of action? What do you want as a school? Do you want that learning matrix to look like? distance learning, remote learning matrix to look like as a school, because the consistency is still just as important. One of the reasons why that matrix is so powerful within our brick and mortar buildings is because everybody's on the same page. Everybody has the same expectations across the board. And what the end goal is what Mrs. Jones and Mr. Taylor and Mrs. Smith, they all expect the same thing across the board in our school. So we know what the expectations are and what the big rules and little rules are. And I know that I'm going to be treated the same and have the same expectations in each of those classrooms. So this is why it's important to, even within this distance learning, to have these conversations as a staff. So especially for middle and high school, when they enter into chemistry and they enter into calculus, they're having the same expectations, and that takes the guesswork out of what each teacher is needing from them in virtual learning. That second question is really for administrators or team leaders. How can you ensure that it's being used across teachers? I can't even imagine the challenges that you all are facing when it comes to this, but I know recently in one of my counties that I have here in the north, when they set up their Zoom meetings once or twice a week, those invites are going to the admins and even the superintendent in the county, and those people are popping in. And I think that's important for kids to know that as well, that there is admin backing up, there's admin checking in, and that's one way you can see, can you see these expectations being used across the board? And so we encourage you to think about what are your next steps. And as you build those next steps, sharing them on whatever platforms you're using, sharing them on social media, sharing them with us so we can share with others to show the great work that you're doing. But it's one of those things where you might need to walk away, you might need to digest it, just depending on where you are with your adjustment of what we're doing, but begin to really think. That's what we do in PBIS. We look at our data, we look at what challenges we're having, we make a plan, and then we put it into action. And that we still need to kind of share that and do that same thought process for how we're going to implement this into the world that we're living in right now.
Nice job, Alicia. Thank you. If you guys need anything, I don't have the dates and time. There's a message. I don't have the dates and times for the next meetings. Alicia, you got that?
I do. We are working on sending those out, invites out, but there is going to be one on Thursday, and that's April 16th on the PBIS matrix. There's going to be one on April 21st about acknowledgments for distance learning. There's going to be one on April 23rd about how we can support our most vulnerable students, and April 28th for self-care for educators. Those are quick turnarounds. They're all going to be recorded, and our hopes are that they're going to go on the WVDE COVID-19 response website, but also we're hoping to post them on us too. So on ours, not us, sorry. And we selected a very small, we sent it to our academy schools for this first, the first two almost trial runs of using Zoom, but these will be going out to our much bigger listserv. So we're hoping to see lots of people there. And we thank you for your attendance today.
Alicia, do you care to share your contact information real quick, like email and such?
Yeah, my email is Holt, HOLT64@marshall.edu. And I will put out there, our behavior support specialists, we're learning how to do these trainings via whatever platform your county is using. We're doing different self-care, trauma. We're starting to hear more about support. And I've even been in meetings where we're thinking about PBIS next year and how schools are rolling that out. So if your brain's thinking and you can get people involved in some meetings, we're more than happy to support you with what you've got going on. We're learning too, but we can be there for you.
For more information regarding the West Virginia PBIS project, you can go to www.wvpbis.org. For more information regarding the West Virginia Behavior Mental Health Technical Assistance Center, you can go to www.marshall.edu/BMHTAC. For the most current information regarding the West Virginia Department of Education's response to the COVID-19 crisis, you can go to www.wvde.us/COVID-19. This site also has resources for families as well as educators.